You need to think global much earlier because that will impact the way you build your product, your teams, your culture, and even processes within the organization that's going to enable you to scale in the future.
Welcome to the Excellent International Leadership Podcast. Your host today works with the world's leading experts on international leadership, helping them find purpose and implement their vision. She's a master certified coach and facilitates a mastermind for CEOs of international companies. She's the author of 3 books and works with Nestle, Novartis, and even the United Nations. She's especially good at helping executives fast track to the C-suite. Welcome, Dr. Katrina Bruce.
Having a strong international brand that is recognized around the world makes you less vulnerable to competition. However, so many companies fail when going abroad. Klaus Wehage is an expert at helping companies to expand internationally. What are the success secrets and challenges? Let's listen to Klaus. Welcome to the International Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Bruce, and today we have Klaus Wehage. Welcome, Klaus.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. So I appreciate the invitation. And I know you've been chasing me down a little bit over the last period, but it's been busy with the book launch and everything. But I'm excited to be here today. Thank you so much.
Good. And you're an expert in international expansion, and you developed a methodology in your book, Global Class.
Right.
So tell us a little bit, what's the key message of your book?
Oh, there's quite a few, right? But a lot of the stuff that we talk about is that it's also about building the capabilities within your organization to be successful when you go international, right? In the book, we talk about global class companies, where we say that you need to think global early on as you're building the business, because that will also be a little bit, predicted in terms of how you're going to be successful international in the future. With a lot of the companies that we typically work with our consulting firm, where we work with a lot of early stage companies, we see a tendency for, entrepreneurs and startups that are running scale-ups, that they hard code the business around their local market, right? For example, I spoke to a fast-growing company from Korea about 1.5 months ago. I can't mention their name because I don't want to kind of throw them under the bus here, but they have raised a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have 600 employees. And in the conversation with the leadership team and the founder and CEO, I asked them, how many languages could you speak at the office if you ask all your employees? And they kind of giggled a little bit and said maybe 3 languages. And that to me is an indicator that you hard-coded your business around your Korean market. And imagine if you then want to take it international, that's going to be extremely hard. Because if you hire someone in the US or in Indonesia and other markets that needs to deal and interact with the headquarters to be able to get resources and support for the expansion, that's going to be very, very hard. There's going to be a lot of latency, a lot of misunderstanding, etc. So what we talk about is that you need to think global much earlier, because that will impact the way you build your product, your teams, your culture, and even processes within the organization that's going to enable you to scale in the future as a
So
company.
give us some concrete examples of how you would determine the readiness of a company to go international.
Oh, there's obviously a lot of elements, but I think the most important piece is around people, right? Diversity in the organization, right? To give you an example is Pleo, a Danish company, when they were 21 hires within their sort of organization, they already could speak 17 different languages. Fast forward to today, I think they're around 800 people, and they're a global organization. They've scaled very, very fast beyond Denmark, which were their first initial small market, right? Another example is Canva, which is probably known today by most people, who are disrupting, Microsoft, Google, all those big incumbents, right? Before the pandemic, I believe there were around 200 people, and they spoke around 70 different languages within the organization. Had teams located around the world, so I had much more of a distributed approach when it comes to talent development. And I think when it comes to thinking that way and hiring people in that way, you also get eyes and ears into the world. You are able to see other patterns and trends that also can feed into how you build your product as well.
So you said about, okay, the languages is very important and the hiring. So what about the hiring? How do you hire somebody that's the perfect person for an international market?
That is obviously very, very hard to identify. In fact, when we spoke to executives, that was by far the hardest thing to do. It's hiring and team building. And I'm happy to kind of flash a little bit if you're going to be showing this video later in some of your resources and where you're distributing the podcast. But we actually developed something called an entrepreneur, sort of a mindset of an individual that you should look for when you want to go international. And it's sort of playing on that entrepreneurial concept, but is an evolution of that concept, if you will. For those that will be viewing this podcast, you can then see that there's a pyramid of three layers, where in the bottom we say that there is the agile mindset. People who are iterative, resilient, growth focused, sort of the classical entrepreneurial concept and mindset that we talk about today. That is given away for companies wanting to have these agile thinkers within their organizations, people who can navigate bureaucracy, build coalition and buy-in. And we label that as the company mindset. And those two together forms the intrapreneurial mindset within large organizations. Basically, people who drive certain initiatives that moves the needle around digital transformation and innovation within companies. But what we then say is the sort of tip of the pyramid is a culture mindset. Global mindedness, culture curiosity that allows people and leaders to have empathy with local markets and ecosystems and cultures to then identify how to localize the business for successful expansion when they want to go global. And we find this to be extremely important and is the skill set of the next decade, also verified by a lot of the companies that we interviewed, where they say you can absolutely not become a leader in the companies if you do not have international experience, because we are a global company, right? To give you an example of how to maybe identify these leaders, we often talk about formative experiences that have sort of led them on the path to build an international career. And I'll highlight three people in particular. Abe Smith, who you can see in the bottom right, he's the head of international at Zoom. He was an English teacher in a rural fishing village in Kyushu, Japan, that gave him the aspiration and the motivation to build a global career. He has that curiosity because he was pulled out of his backyard in America and planted in a completely foreign environment, and that really enabled him to build this global career. After that immersive experience in Japan, he then went back to the US. He joined a small bagel company, yes, bagel as in eating bagels. He helped grow and develop that company, but he also helped that company expand to Japan as well. Again, going back to his experiences, his view into other parts of the world, and seeing opportunity for that bagel company to expand to Japan. And so again, that agile mindset.
Klaus, I
Yeah.
just want to make a
Sure.
point. So you made a point that the
Sure.
multicultural, and
Yep.
meaning in the language, they can speak
Sure.
several languages. He grew up at a significant time in his life
Right.
in two different cultures. So
Right.
he's neither Japanese or whatever first country he was from. He's sort of in between, what we call sometimes global nomad.
Right,
Would you say
right.
so?
I guess A. Smith, he grew up in the US, but he went over to teach English. But that's more. But there's another example that we share about, which is Masami Takahashi. He led expansion and growth for Uber and WeWork. Very successful person. But he was actually living, in other parts of the world in his early life because his dad was a journalist. So he lived in the UK, he lived in other parts of Europe, so he was pulled away, obviously, from the Japanese culture, but he really were immersed in different types of culture that gave him that mental flexibility, if you will, to operate in different types of environments, right? In hot and cold water, if you will, if you consider like fish and all that stuff, right? So I think it gives a lot of that flexibility in a human being that is able to tackle something like very difficult, as it is with expansion, where you take a company from one market to another, and you have to realize that it's going to be very different, right? That journey.
So, what can you explicate that is the particular skill that they get from having multicultural references, national cultural references? What
Right.
is the skill set?
I guess I can kind of show you another framework that we built where we talk about traits and skill sets, right? We built a team building framework in the book, but I just want to portray, and this is also something that I want to clarify something that we talk about in the book. We're not culture experts per se, but we have built tools that allow companies to identify certain things that are important when you go international, right? And With this team building framework, we have built certain traits around that you should look for when you actually want to build a team when you go international. So, for example, in the top left corner, you see the entrepreneurial mindset as I talked about a little bit earlier, right?
Right.
Agile mindset people are grit, comfort with ambiguity, open to failure, problem solving, customer development mindset. Then the company mindset is strong collaboration skills, navigating bureaucracy, etc. But the cultural mindset is really values diversity, holds bias. I think is extremely important when you want to take a company international, because you can't be biased towards what's already been done, because then you'll fail, right? But I think one of the most important things that I've found is curiosity. You need to be curious,
Yeah.
because if you're not curious to learn, then you're not going to be able to understand. We say a little bit in the book, if you seek to learn and understand, nothing will be foreign. That's one of the quotes in the book, and we're true believers in that, right? Because you really need to just engage and learn and understand before making decisions when it comes to international, in our opinion.
Yes, it's an open mindset so that you can observe and then understand, then adapt. Let's
Yes,
say.
exactly. Exactly. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, it did. So tell us what companies need to assess for their readiness to go international. So you've mentioned the hiring process, the mindset, the team mindset. What other things that they knew on a business level, like cost or scalability?
We often get the question from companies, how many markets can we tackle at the same time? And it often depends on the sort of the capabilities you build within the organization. We often say that how many customer development programs can you run at the same time? That's the big question, right? Because at the end of the day, international expansion also becomes a stress on the organization. Because all of a sudden you need to spend resources on other markets, right? You need to change your product, you need to hire new people in new countries. So it impacts all functions of the organization. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is building structures and processes that really allows for this to happen, right? And we developed something we call a localization resource team within the company that in the early stages can be shared or fully developed as sort of a mechanism. And that localization resource team is sort of the front door for local teams to interact, and they can help navigate the organization bureaucracy that will happen inevitably to help get these resources internally. For example, if a local team says, "Oh, we need to change part of our product in order to really fully resonate with the local consumer," then that localization resource team can go and actually get that done internally within the company. Go to that particular function within the company to make sure it becomes a priority within the organization. Because what often happens is when companies go international is that the organization, the headquarter or the established part of the company is biased towards what's already been done, right? And so you need to find a way to avoid this to happen, because obviously when you go international again, you can't just hold to that bias that we talked about a little bit earlier, right? You need to relearn all of a sudden. You need to be open, and you need to have that curiosity to be willing to change as an organization and listen to obviously the local teams that are understanding and doing this discovery at a local level to figure out how to best find product market fit in new markets.
So I want you to define localization and how it differs from globalization for our listeners.
Right. So localization, and I'll flash something again for those that want to view this podcast, but we have developed something called a localization premium analysis tool in the book. And what we say is that localization is not just language translation, which it's often associated with that. It's actually considering all aspects of your business, right? Everything from your marketing to your sales organization and sales model to changes in product to even hiring and so forth, right? You need to localize the business to be successful. We share a little bit of an outlier example when it comes to localization with the company like Zendesk. Zendesk is a Danish company that chose to scale in the US. They're located in an area called Tenderloin, which is an area in San Francisco that has a lot of homelessness, and they're a big, proponent on community impact. Very, very big in that, and so they're focused on the homelessness community in San Francisco. But then when they expanded to Singapore, the employees were like, "Homelessness does not really resonate with us because there's not a big issue around that in Singapore." And so they instead actually discovered that there was a lot of senior isolation happening, they started to focus on that because as soon as people turn 62, they get pushed out of the workforce. So the community impact area, they localized to focus on that in Singapore. Other localization stories that we share is around, like, for example, product. DocuSign, which is a signature platform from the Bay Area, when they were expanding to Japan, they could easily have said, hey, signatures, which is, obviously the common norm in the US and around the world to sign documents, that's going to be how we enter into Japan. But they realized that that's not the norm in terms of signing documents. Actually, what you do there is stamps, hanko stamps, which is a physical wooden piece that you just press on a piece of paper, and that's the way you sign documents. And so they recognized that cultural importance of, stamping documents in Japan, and took a little bit of a unique approach, in my opinion, where they then partner with a local hanko stamp maker called Shachihata that only does physical hanko stamp, but said, hey, we want to partner with you and we want to come to Japan. We want to respect this cultural norm, partner with you, and then create an e-hanko on the platform. Obviously, we could adhere to that practice, and then we'll share a part of the economics with you as an organization.
But how could they
So
do that virtually if they'd like it stamped and physical?
yeah, I mean, they obviously talk to each other in terms of how to localize that, that part of the platform. I don't know the detailed story around that, but the unique part of the story is that they recognize that, cultural significance, and they also share the part of the economics. And instead, for example, if you compare to Uber, as a company that went in to disrupt the markets and leave a lot of scorched earth and asking for forgiveness later, pushing the model through different municipalities, say, we're just going to go all in and disrupt everything. They were very successful because they didn't disrupt the hanko stamp making sort of industry, but they want to partner with them instead. And so what we see here in the book is that you should, think about partnerships rather than disruption when you go into new markets, because oftentimes you'll fail.
In
So
Uber's case, what would you have suggested to them? Because they were disrupted, to work with the taxis or to work with the government to do a
right.
transition process?
It's obviously, I can't give you the exact strategy
Of
for them,
course.
but what I would say is that they should have taking much more of a collaborative approach, right? Instead of like being disruptive, but figuring out how can we enable and support and grow the industry, and figuring out a way to actually collaborate with the regulatory environment to introduce this to the industry, right? And so that will be my recommendation overall, and not just go in and say, hey, we're going to enter, we're just going to, wait until you guys react in the market, and we're going to disrupt as much as possible, and then ask for forgiveness later. That didn't work, obviously, right? And so that worked in the US, but that model didn't work abroad. So I think it's about being culturally sensitive and also being more collaborative when you enter in with a disruptive technology, as Uber was inevitably, obviously, to a more traditional industry in the market.
Well said. Well said. So, what happens if it's an American that has experience selling U.S. products in U.S.? What would you, and they want to go into international business, what would you suggest?
As an overall process, right, we talk about you need to revisit customer discovery and customer development. Right, we built a tool called the business model localization canvas, which I can also share. And we talk about when you want to start to go international, it's about trying to learn and understand in the beginning. And so we talk about you need to do what we call localization discovery, right? You need to go in market, you need to go in to talk to stakeholders. You need to then learn and understand how you possibly need to adapt your business model to be successful in that market. What we often see companies fail with is asking key questions, right? So if you look at this model that we have here, we say you have to take your validated model in your initial market and run it through two filters: government and regulation, and culture, and then create your hypotheses in terms of how you need to change. And so if you take the key partner category as an example, when you expand the business into Middle East, in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, you have to stand up a joint venture and not just have your own entity operating. So that impacts the way you operate in the market. So that's a government mandated thing that you have to do. So that's government and regulation and how that impacts your ability to operate in that market. But in that culture example was DocuSign, cultural norms, right? We have to partner with a local entity and local organization to then introduce the product to the market. And I think often when we work with companies, it's about going through, okay, what is your business model? What made you successful at home? And let's then identify what are the key questions you need to ask yourself to challenge that business model when you then go international? By figuring out what are those key questions for you as an organization, will then help you identify who to talk to when you then want to go and do your localization discovery, going to these new markets, right? So it's really about thinking about these things so you fully understand sort of what are the most important questions you have in mind.
Well said. And Dumaine, Brian Dumaine, who was on the show
Right.
earlier, he wrote a book called Bezonomics. And he said the biggest challenge that Amazon had going international was first the transport costs, privacy rules, the hiring
Right.
regulations, which made the cost and the resistance to buying also much higher. But for example, the iCloud, the cloud
Right.
storage was easy because it has no boundaries. Those are some of the costs I would imagine that are higher going international.
Yeah, I think the whole cost element of it is a little bit abstract to many organizations when they want to go international, and that's why we developed the localization premium analysis tool. That is the spider chart I showed you, and we have a backend tool actually there that helps you fully understand all the things you need to change in your business model. And it's not just that visual tool, but in that tool, backend tool, we then also are able to outline what are the costs associated to these localization and what at the end are the market entry cost, right? How much will it actually cost you to enter into that market? And then it'll also allow you to map out what are the priorities now versus later. What's the stage one in terms of localization implementation? What's the stage two, stage three, stage four, etc. So the point being is that we're trying to bring it down to a very practical level and granular level to map these things out. So it helps you to predict those costs and then plan a little bit better around your expansion strategy. Because also, when it comes to when you expand to new markets, you can't just say yes to everything as an organization. You also have to pick, say no as well. Part of that process is also saying, no, we're not going to do this now. We may be doing that later. So you need to figure out what are the most important things to change when you enter into a market. And then you can kind of bucket the other things in terms of thinking about doing that much later. And maybe when they see other patterns in other countries that are requiring those localizations as well. I think that was one of the big things that we learned from an executive from Slack. He says one of the most important things when you go international is also to the ability to say no. And it's a very simple concept because you have a tendency when you engage with customers in new markets, say, yes, we want to do it. We want to do it. We want to secure the customer. We want to do business, etc. But as soon as you say no to everything, it'll put a lot of stress on the organization overall.
And can you describe a little bit in detail the stress it puts on the organization? Give us an example.
Oh, that's a good question. The stress it puts on an organization. Let me think a little bit about that. To give you an example on the stress it puts on an organization when it comes to expansion, let's pick a function as an example, right? When you go international, to the point of that Korean company I talked to a little bit earlier, they want to be able to scale up fast, hire fast, etc. They have built a very much a Korean HR function, and then all of a sudden they're thinking about, can we actually get that HR function to hire in new markets, or do we have to create a whole new HR function in the company? That becomes a stressful sort of mechanism you need to build within the organization. And how do you align both parties if they build a separate function as well? Because you also want to assure sort of universality around culture and values, etc. So you have two different HR functions, maybe misaligned as well. So there's a lot of complexity all of a sudden that gets added to it when you haven't really built that muscle up from the early stages of building your company. And so you need to think about, as soon as you expand globally, it puts the pressure on product. It puts a pressure on marketing team to serve that local market, to give them use cases to communicate to customers. It puts a pressure on the sales model or even customer service. For example, in the US, customer service is fully digitized. But when you go into Japan, Japanese customers expect a human being to service them. It's a call center. Or in Korea, we even heard stories about big Korean conglomerates. They will ask you to have a full account team to be hired to service that customer, to be dedicated to that customer over a long time. And this becomes hard to manage, right? And so there's a lot of elements to the added stress and also culture, right? All of a sudden you have, how do you manage your local team in Japan? How do you build a flatter hierarchy, type of culture and transparent type of culture do you often want to develop in the US? How do you create the same mix in Japan? It's often not that way, right? Where feedback is not as openly shared as it is in the US. How do you then change the way you have your feedback in Japan and engage with local teams? How do you culturally conscious manage that team, as we also talk about in the book, right? So there's a myriad of examples that we can go through, and happy to talk about it more, obviously.
So somebody wants to is American, worked in America, was very successful. What would you advise him or her to have an international experience? What would be the first steps according to you?
I think it's about being immersed, to be honest. Because if you're not immersed, you don't understand the reality, right? To give you another example, and again, I can't mention a name, but we spoke to a managing director of the UK, and it's an American company, very successful in the US. He has been leading that market, I think, for the past 3 years, and I think there's three co-founders. And we asked him, so how many times have the co-founders been to that market? And he said one time, one of the co-founders. And I think that's often the biggest mistake that we see with companies, is that the leadership team are not exposed to the local reality. We often share also the story of Airbnb when they were expanding to Asia, and in particular Korea. Brian Chesky, the CEO and founder, he actually went over to Korea before they actually launched, and actually were trying to observe users of Airbnb in Korea through a one-way mirror to understand how they actually use the application. So he understood the reality as well in that market. So being immersed, and I think one of the most important thing as that you can do as a local leader to try to engage with leadership team and have them understand, is to make the leadership team fall in love with the country. That is Masami Takahashi that said that word to us. You need to inspire them to be emotionally involved in that market, because if they're not emotionally involved, you'll not get the resources you need to lead expansion. And that only comes by exposing them to the environment, immersing them, having them feel the culture, and really understanding that local context.
I think that's a great point. You know, I interviewed also on this podcast, Excellent Leadership, Peter Brabeck, who was the CEO of Nestle and past German. And
Cool.
he said international experience and speaking several languages is important. And I said, of course, the usual question I ask is why?
Right.
And he said, look, we have like Magi, it's global.
Right.
The product is global, but she or he as a leader has to understand the local culture and the local taste because it's adapted to that market. And
Right.
without that kind of experience, they would standardize everything and of course would have the same effect. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. I mean, my experience in Vietnam, that was in 2000, is it 12, I believe now. I was a part of a relaunch team in Vietnam for Carlsberg, one of the biggest beer room companies in the world. And we were also doing user testing with local consumers. And one of the things that we found out with the beers that they had in the market, the consumers didn't like it. It was too bitter, because Vietnamese people like sweeter things, sweeter beers and all that stuff. If you don't understand how they react to certain taste in that market, you're going to be not successful, because you can't just change a person's palates, right? You
Yes.
need to localize it, right? And so it sounds very simple, but there is a tendency, and that is the bias that we talked about a little bit earlier, to standardize. That is the bias. We were successful at home, that can be translated abroad, but it just can't. And then you have to really figure out what are the most important things that you need to adapt. And when it comes to consumer, like products and beverage products and food, oh, taste buttons, you can't change that at all. That's not going to happen. So you
It,
need to figure out,
it's
does
very,
that product resonate with the
yes,
local
it's
consumer?
very culturally specific. And coming from Switzerland, I love chocolate. I come here, I find it
Right.
too sweet, too this, too that.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
If someone wants to go international, what would be their biggest advantage of going international besides making more money? But what would you say be a huge advantage?
I would say you be able to make your product or company more resilient to competition. That would be my main message. To give you an example, one of my good friends, he is one of the leading investors in Southeast Asia, but he was one of the guys that founded a company called Mixi in Japan, which were the Facebook of Japan back in the day. Very successful. I think they were valued around $3 billion back then. And then all of a sudden, Facebook came in and they outcompeted them. And so their valuation dropped very, very quickly. What later they were actually good at, they were able to pivot that company into being a gaming company because they have a large usage still. But if they had maybe gone international earlier, they would maybe have been able to better compete against Facebook, right? But the reality is that they weren't able to compete because they're so focused on local markets. It can also be a competitive advantage because you're such a local company. You've been able to localize and hardcode around the Korean market that then you also are able to keep competition away. Kakao is a great example in Korea that is an app now building a super app. They're the most used product in Korea in terms of the application, and they have Kakao Taxi and all that stuff. They have a lot of different services. So that's very hard coded around the Korean market, but they're not successful abroad. So in Korea, there's a tendency to have very much a local product. And so that's a little bit, there's pros and cons, and you have to pick and choose. Do you want to be a global company or do you not want to be a global company? If you don't want to be a global company, you are going to face competition down the road for sure. And so it all boils down to your ability to be super hard coded, super local that then can keep competition off. If you're not, then you're likely going to be outcompeted. And yeah, so it's a matter of a mindset and what you pick in terms of priority as a business, right? But we believe that you should think global. It's in particular around when you're a technology company. I think that's important.
Right. Well, speaking about technology and social media, the
Right.
Chinese invented TikTok, and now it's rampant here in the US.
Right. One
Yeah.
of the few success stories. I don't really know many other Chinese success stories abroad, and in particular, in particular in the U.S., right? You typically don't see that too often, right? And now also even there's a conversation around whether or not it's been used for bad things, right? But that's a whole separate topic, right? But that's one of the few success stories, and we don't see a lot of other companies being successful in China either. I know LinkedIn just pulled out of China as an example before, talking about them being one of the only social media company or one of the few successful companies in China. They also had to pull out because certain issues that were arising that can't really speak about here on this podcast that's a little bit more sensitive. But you see typically those two markets doesn't really gel well with each other, and a lot of technology companies has to simply just not pick going there.
So I want to ask you one last question. As globalization was accelerating in the past
Right.
and expanding, now we could ask maybe it's not going to be accelerating and might even decrease. What's your opinion about that?
Well, I think there's two sides to the story, obviously. But yes, you see companies that had supply chains and manufacturing in China pulling out, right? Reevaluating things because it's high risk for them to be reliant on having things produced in China. So you see, I think it's like Vietnam that gets part of it and other Southeast Asian countries now. And then in Europe around energy. I know Germany was energy dependent on Russia, right, as an example. Now
60,
they're
I think
figuring that out.
60% or something like that. I
Yes,
mean,
yes, yes.
tremendous.
Yes, exactly. And they all obviously have to reevaluate things, right? So it's very, very dynamic around those things. But I'm also a big believer in that there's also an opportunity here, right? While other companies are pulling back in terms of international, there's an opportunity to also push forward and capture market share. To give you an example, a company called Kavak that's based out of Mexico. It's an out-of-tech platform, trading platform. They raised a lot of money, very successful company in the region. they announced that they're going to be investing around $200 million in expansion. And they have learned that muscle, right? They have expanded into other countries. So they have a little bit of a playbook already developed around understanding how do we actually enter into a market, how do we find product market fit, and also how do we scale. And so they're fairly confident with their methodology. And then they're saying, hey, even though there's an economic crisis coming, our model is a little bit, recession resilient. And then also we understand the playbook. So we're going to push forward. So you can have that as an opportunity as well. And there's also a lot of companies that are very successful around the last crisis, right? I think Airbnb got born out of the crisis back in 2008, 2009. And so those that are able to accelerate right now and see as an opportunity can actually be the incumbents of the future. And there's also actually a an opportunity around talent because right now there's a lot of people who are getting laid off. So you can get people at a lower cost, right? And there's not that same talent crunch as we've seen over the past many years. So you can actually get more resources as well for cheap compared to before. So there are certain opportunities that you can also tap into even during an economic crisis.
Yes, and I mean, now you don't hesitate to really work with people in the Philippines or different
Right,
countries or different platforms and all
right.
virtual. How do you think the virtuality of the business has affected business internationally?
The virtuality, you mean distributed teams and everything?
No, the being able to be on Zoom like we are today,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
do business virtually instead of face to face.
Right. I think there's always a spectrum around these things, right? I think it moved so far to one side in terms of virtual teams and all that stuff that it's been, obviously the model and during the pandemic, but I think we're going to swing a little bit back now again. I think when it comes to doing business, doing sales and all that stuff, I think still you have to be immersed in countries, in my opinion. You have to be close to customers because things are changing so fast and rapidly in a local market, right? So when you are on the customer side, I think it's still important to be close to the customer. If you're not close to the customer, it's hard to really truly understand what's happening at the ground level. But obviously there's things that can be done virtually as well. You're seeing a lot of companies going full virtual model. I think in order to do that, you have to have a really, really strong company culture to be able to operate fully virtual as a business. Because I think it's natural human behavior to also have a home as well. And so if you don't have a home, people to go to, feel that bond and gel, it's going to be harder to retain people as well. And strong culture will be that, but also the relationship you form at the job. And so I'm not so sure that I'm a big believer in full virtual models to the extent that you see some companies do, because I'm also very much a person that likes human interactions and
Sure.
physical interactions with people, and kind of being able to see people beyond their shoulder and up, but actually see how they move their hands and all that stuff, right? I think it's really, really important. Also, to when you engage with the customer, how can you analyze how they sort of respond to the conversation? You can on Zoom, but it's still a limited view that you have. You don't go to dinner with them. You don't see how they're interacting in terms of with other people, and you cannot develop the same level of trust, in my opinion, as you are when you are in front of a human being. That's at least my opinion, to be
Yes, I'm
honest.
a fan of the author Nonaka, who says
Right,
there's two types of knowledge: the explicit knowledge and the
right,
tacit knowledge. And
yeah,
there's as much communication in the tacit knowledge, meaning how they
100%.
observe them in public, what they're not saying it, how they say it, the body language. Is all a form of communication that can't be
100%.
readily tapped into.
100%. Imagine if you're Nike, and I think the former, she was like a VP of marketing at Nike. We had her to present to a Japanese cohort a couple of weeks ago. She shared with us a story around Nike when they went into Japan. They couldn't really understand why consumers didn't really respond to the beautiful shoes because they're beautiful on the side and everything and very well designed. But then they found out that when Japanese people buy shoes and they look at, the shoes when they wear them and everything, they look at the shoe from above because that to them
Ah,
is the way that, it's beautifully designed and everything. So they didn't respond well to the design of Nike shoes because from above it didn't look as nice, right? Because for us, it's on the sides when people can see our shoes when we walk about the streets. And you cannot do that when you're, virtual. You have to actually be there physical in the stores to actually see how people use the product. The same with Brian Chesky and Airbnb. You have to go and actually see how people respond to their app. So I think a lot of the business that's around understanding localization and changes in the product and business model, that has to be done at a local level, in my opinion.
Klaus, I could talk to you forever or interview you forever, but we're coming at the end of our podcast. Where can people get a hold of you and purchase your book?
So Global Class can be purchased on Amazon, as an example, right? That's one. And then they can always reach out to me on Klaus, Klaus, at globalclasscompany.com. globalclasscompany.com. And again, we work with a lot of scale-ups and corporates that want to refine their international strategy, and happy to support companies as they are going through this journey. And in around Q2, we're going to be launching an online curriculum on this topic as well. So there's going to be an online learning platform where people can just go in and tune in on this topic and learn as fast as possible through
Great.
bite-sized videos.
A much needed skill, too.
I think so.
Thank you,
I appreciate
Klaus.
the invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent International Leadership Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com and select podcasts. Join us each Thursday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your leadership to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's coaching programs and the International Leadership Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.